Some stories are written in gunpowder and gold. This ain't one of them. This story is carved in the cracked, thirsty dirt of the Arizona Territory, a tale of a girl the world tried its best to forget. Her name was Lydia Mayhew. She didn't have a fast horse or a silver-plated pistol. All she had was a knowledge of roots and herbs and a heart that hadn't yet turned to stone like the land around her. On a day that started just like any other, under a sun that hated everything that lived, she'd make a choice. A simple choice that would save two lives. And in doing so, she'd push an entire town to the brink of a war it had no chance of winning. What came next was a decision from a powerful chief so strange, so completely mind-bending, it would change the meaning of debt, justice, and power in the wild, untamed West forever. Lydia Mayhew was a ghost, a whisper on the edge of a town called Redemption Gulch. The town was a scar on the land, a collection of clapboard shacks and simmering sin that had a long memory and zero charity. Lydia was proof of both. Her folks, a pair of hopeful dreamers, had chased gold and found a fever that took them both a decade ago. They left their 15-year-old daughter with nothing but a leaning shack and a bad name. The town hated her parents for being soft, and it was a hatred they were more than happy to pass down to her. Now 25, Lydia had turned survival into a quiet science. She was a wisp of a thing, with sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of a washed-out sky. Her hands were thin, but they were tough, calloused from digging and stained by berries. This was how she made her living. Her remedies. The town might spit her name, but they couldn't deny her skill. Mrs. Gable, the store owner's wife, would send her boy under the cover of darkness for a poultice to soothe her husband's aching back. Even Sheriff Barton, a man whose heart was a shriveled-up piece of jerky, had secretly sent a deputy for a tincture when a toothache nearly drove him mad. They paid her in scraps, a half-empty sack of flour, a few mealy potatoes. Never enough, just enough to keep breathing. Her shack was a perfect picture of her life. It leaned with the wind, its timbers groaning. Inside, bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the single room with the smell of yarrow, chamomile, and bitter wormwood. It was the only place she could breathe, the only place she wasn't the hedge witch of the gulch. On this day, the sun was a hot white fist punching the land. Lydia was miles from town, deep in the Sunstone Canyons, a maze of red rock that was the unofficial border of Apache territory. No one from town came out this far. They called it the Devil's Backyard, home to rattlers, mountain lions, and the silent, ever-present threat of the tribe. But Lydia found a kind of peace out here. The rocks didn't judge. They just stood, ancient and silent. She was looking for a stubborn little plant called Bishop's Weed, and she was moving with a practiced silence, her eyes scanning the ground. It was in a narrow shadowed wash that she found it, not the herb, something else. The first thing she saw was the color, a splash of dark crimson staining the pale dust. Blood, a lot of it. Her heart kicked against her ribs like a trapped bird. The smart thing to do was run, turn around and never look back. But then she heard it, a low groan, a sound of such pure agony it didn't need words. It was the sound of a life trying to hold on. The healer in her wouldn't let her run. She followed the sound around a massive boulder, and her breath caught in her chest. Lying in the dust were two figures, two women, Apache, and they were staggering. They were giants. Both of them were a head taller than any man in Redemption Gulch, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle and muscles corded on their arms. These weren't women who spent their days grinding corn. These were warriors. One lay completely still, her face a pale, ashen color. A crude, bloody bandage was wrapped around her thigh, where a bone had clearly snapped and torn through the skin. The other was propped up on one elbow, a nasty gash running from her temple down her cheek, her dark eyes glassy with fever. A shattered rifle lay nearby. It was easy to read the story. A bad fall from the canyon rim. The conscious one's eyes snapped open as Lydia took a step closer. They burned with a fierce, cornered animal fury. Her hand went for the knife at her belt. A low, guttural warning rumbled in her throat. Lydia froze. She held up her hands, palms open, to show she was empty. Suddenly, her little satchel of herbs felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Every campfire story about Apache massacres screamed at her to get out of there. The sheriff's words echoed in her head. You see one of them, you don't ask questions. You ride or you shoot. Ishtinamam, but then her eyes moved past the warrior's glare to the face of the other one. Her breathing was shallow, a ragged, wet noise that spoke of broken things inside. Her skin was clammy, her life was flickering out. Lydia didn't see an enemy. She saw a person dying. And the outcast of Redemption Gulch, the girl who'd been shown so little kindness, found she couldn't just walk away. She couldn't leave another human being to the vultures that were already circling high above. I mean you no harm, she whispered, her voice barely making a sound. I can help. The warrior's eyes narrowed, her knuckles bone white on the handle of her knife. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. For a long, terrible moment, all three of their lives hung there in the shimmering heat. Run and save herself, or stay and risk everything for two people the world called her mortal enemies. The sun beat down, the vultures circled, and Lydia Mayhew made her choice. But she had no idea that her choice was about to uncover a secret far darker and more dangerous than a simple fall from a cliff. The air in the wash was thick enough to chew, a nasty cocktail of dust and fear. The Apache warrior, who Lydia would later learn was named Nita, watched her with an unbroken, hostile stare. The unconscious one was her sister Ka. Lydia knelt down slowly, her movements small and deliberate. She opened her satchel and laid out its contents on a flat rock. Dried leaves, clay pots of salve, clean strips of linen, and her one good skinning knife. Nita's eyes locked onto the blade, and another growl rumbled deep in her chest. For herbs, Lydia said softly, picking up the knife and slicing a piece of willow bark to show its purpose. Only for herbs. She turned her attention to Ka. The leg wound was a nightmare, a compound fracture, caked in dirt and grime. The angry red streaks of infection were already crawling up her leg. Without help and fast, she'd lose the leg, or her life. Lydia crawled closer. I need water, she murmured, mostly to herself. Her own canteen was almost empty. Her eyes darted around the canyon floor until she spotted a patch of darker, damp-looking sand. A seep. She pointed to her canteen, then to the damp patch, looking at Nita. The warrior's expression was a stone mask. Taking a huge risk, Lydia stood and walked to the spot. She dug with her bare hands, the warrior's eyes burning into her back. Slowly, a small puddle of muddy water began to form. She used a strip of her linen to filter the gritty water into her canteen, over and over, until it was full. Now came the hard part, the dangerous part. She had to clean the wound, and it was going to hurt. A lot. She looked at Nita, her blue eyes pleading for trust. She pointed at the mangled leg, then at the clean water, and made a gentle washing motion. Nita's gaze flickered from Lydia to her sister to the knife on the rock. A silent war was raging in her eyes. Finally, with a nod so small it was barely there, she slumped back against the rock. Her hand never left her knife, but the immediate threat seemed to pass. Lydia worked with a laser focus. She gently cut away the buckskin around the wound. Ka moaned but didn't wake. Using the filtered water, Lydia began to clean away the dirt and rock fragments, her stomach churning at the sight of splintered bone. As she cleaned, her fingers brushed against something hard, buried deep in the torn flesh near the break. It wasn't a rock fragment. It was smooth and cold, metallic. With a surge of dread, she worked it loose. It was a misshapen piece of lead. A bullet. This wasn't a fall. They had been shot. This changes everything, she thought. Someone had shot them and left them for dead. Someone with a rifle. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just Apache territory. It was a crime scene, and she was now a witness. She quickly hid the lead slug in her pocket. Nita must not know. Not yet. Panic could get them all killed. She forced herself to stay calm. She crushed dried yarrow and willow bark into a thick green paste and applied it to the wound. The medicinal scent filled the air. Ka's skin was burning with fever. Lydia pressed gently on her ribs and earned a deep groan. Broken ribs, maybe a punctured lung. Nothing she could do for that out here. She splinted the leg between two pieces of driftwood and bound it tight. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon in shades of blood and fire, she finally turned to Nita. The gash on her face was deep, but the real danger was the fever that was making her shiver in the evening heat. "You need to drink," Lydia said, holding out the canteen. Nita stared at it suspicious. Lydia took a small sip herself, then offered it again. Hesitantly, Nita took it and drank. Lydia made her a simple poultice and a tea from the willow bark. They sat in silence as darkness fell, a brilliant blanket of uncaring stars overhead. Lydia kept a small, smokeless fire going, periodically checking on Ka, cooling her feverish skin with a damp cloth. Nita watched. Her hostility was slowly being replaced by a weary curiosity. She saw the genuine concern in the small white woman's face. She saw the skill in her hands. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, Ka began to thrash and cry out in her own tongue. Lydia moved to her side and began to hum a simple, tuneless song her mother used to sing to her, a thread of pure compassion in the vast, dangerous dark. Nita's hand, which had been resting on her knife, finally relaxed. A debt was being formed, a debt written not in coin, but in blood and herbs, and shared fear under the stars. And in the heart of the Apache warrior, a fragile trust began to grow. But Lydia knew a terrible secret. These women weren't just fighting an injury. They were fighting an enemy who was still out there. And for all she knew, he could be coming back. Lydia didn't go back to Redemption Gulch that night, or the next. For 2 full days and nights, she was a prisoner of her own compassion, a guardian angel in a place that felt a lot like hell. She used up all her yarrow and willow bark. She ventured farther down the wash for water, every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf sending a jolt of fear through her. Who shot them? Were they prospectors? Hunters from town? The questions gnawed at her. She had to assume the attacker was from Redemption Gulch, which meant walking back into town was walking into a snake pit. Nita, though weak, was now lucid. She helped Lydia grind herbs, her powerful hands surprisingly gentle. They built a clumsy language out of gestures and single words. Water, pain, sleep. Lydia learned their names, Nita and Ka, and Nita learned hers, struggling with the strange sounds. On the morning of the third day, the crisis seemed to have passed. Ka's fever was down, her breathing easier. She was awake, her eyes clear. Nita's strength was returning. They had survived, for now. Lydia knew she had to leave. Her absence would be noticed. Worse, staying here made her a target too. "I have to go," she told Nita, pointing in the direction of town. Redemption Gulch. Nita understood. She gripped Lydia's forearm, her dark eyes filled with a gratitude that was deeper than any words. It was a promise, acknowledgement of a debt. But there was something else in her eyes too. A question. Nita pointed to her sister's bandaged leg, then made a gesture like a gun firing. Her eyes were hard, searching. Lydia's heart hammered. She could lie. She could pretend it was just a fall. But looking into Nita's fierce, intelligent eyes, she knew a lie would be an insult. It would shatter the fragile trust they had built. She took a deep breath, reached into her pocket, and pulled out the flattened lead slug. She placed it in Nita's palm. The warrior's face went rigid. The gratitude in her eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, murderous fire. Her gaze shifted from the bullet to the direction of Redemption Gulch. The promise of friendship was gone, replaced by the promise of vengeance. Lydia realized her mistake. By telling the truth, she might have just signed the whole town's death warrant. "Wait," Lydia said, holding up her hands. She shook her head desperately, pointing from the bullet to the town, then back to herself. She tried to convey that she would find out who did this, that she would seek justice. Nita stared at her for a long moment, the lead slug clenched in her fist. Then she gave a single, sharp nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a stay of execution. "Find them," her eyes said, "or we will." Lydia turned and began the long walk back, a terrible weight on her shoulders. She arrived at the edge of town looking like she'd been dragged through the desert. Her clothes were torn and stained with dirt and dried blood. Her face was gaunt, her hair a mess. Mrs. Hemlock, the town's chief gossip, saw her from the porch of the general store. Her eyes went wide and she scurried off like a rat, no doubt heading for the sheriff. By the time Lydia reached her shack, Sheriff Barton was there, leaning against the doorframe. He was a big man running to fat, with a drooping mustache that couldn't hide his permanent sneer. Well, well, he drawled, his voice like grinding stones. Look what the coyote dragged in. Been gone 3 days, Mayhew. Folks were starting to hope you'd finally met your maker out there. Lydia ignored him, her body screaming for rest. I was gathering herbs, Sheriff. Is that what you're calling it now? Barton pushed himself off the doorframe, his bulk blocking the sun. Mrs. Hemlock saw you coming from the direction of Sunstone Canyons. That's Apache territory. You know the law. No consorting with hostiles. I saw no one, Lydia lied, her voice flat. It was a pathetic lie. Her appearance told a very different story. Barton's eyes narrowed, his gaze falling on the bloodstains on her skirt. They weren't just from herbs. It was too much. Too dark. That right? He said, his voice dropping. Funny. Jebediah and his brother went out prospecting in that direction 3 days ago. Haven't come back yet. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Lydia froze. Jebediah Gable, the store owner's son, a known drunk and a bully, and he had a brother just as mean. They were exactly the type to cross into Apache land looking for an easy score. Her mind raced. The bullet, the shattered rifle. Had Nita and Cobb been defending themselves? Barton stepped closer, his stale whiskey breath washing over her. You look like you've been through a war, Mayhew. You trading your little potions for something else with them savages? The insinuation was disgusting. Anger, sharp and hot, cut through her exhaustion. I trade with no one but the people in this town who come crawling to my door in the middle of the night. Now if you'll excuse me. She tried to push past him, but his hand shot out, clamping down on her shoulder like a bear trap. You listen to me, girl, he growled, his face inches from hers. The Apache have been too quiet. If you're out there stirring up trouble, if Jebediah is missing because of something you did, that trouble is going to visit all of us. And I'll see you swing from a rope myself. You understand? His threat was real. Lydia's defiance collapsed into cold dread. She was an outcast. Her word meant nothing. She nodded, her eyes on the ground. He grunted and released her. Stay put. I'll be watching you. He stomped off, leaving Lydia alone with a new, terrifying piece of the puzzle. 2 men from town were missing. 2 Apache warriors had been shot, and she was standing right in the middle, the only one who knew the truth, or at least part of it. And the part she didn't know was the part that was going to get her killed. The next day, Redemption Gulch was a pot of water about to boil. The town's usual suspicion of Lydia had curdled into outright hostility. When she went to the well, conversation stopped dead. People literally turned their backs on her. Mothers snatched their children away as if she carried a deadly disease. Mrs. Hemlock stood on the mercantile porch, whispering furiously to a group of women, her eyes following Lydia like a hawk tracking a mouse. The news about the missing Gable boys had spread like wildfire, and thanks to the sheriff's veiled threats, everyone knew who to blame. Lydia was no longer just the town witch. She was a traitor, a collaborator, the one who had lured 2 of their own to their deaths at the hands of savages. The fact that the Gable boys were violent drunks who regularly beat their own father didn't matter. They were townfolk. She wasn't. She had saved 2 lives, but in this town, that act of mercy was treason. She sat in her shack, the familiar scent of herbs offering no comfort. She thought about the bullet in her pocket. She had to do something. She couldn't let Nita and Ka start a war over this. But what could she do? Go to Barton? He'd arrest her, or worse. She looked around her small dusty room. There was nowhere to run. The spark that lit the fuse came the very next morning. It wasn't a flame. It was the sound of horses, a lot of them. Lydia was outside tending to her small garden when she felt it first, a low, rhythmic vibration in the ground. Then she heard it, the steady, deliberate beat of dozens of hooves. Her head snapped up. On the main street, doors creaked open. Pale, frightened faces peered out. They came over the rise, black silhouettes against the blazing morning sun. It wasn't a war party. It was something else, something far more terrifying. It was a formal procession. At least 30 riders, all Apache, moving with a disciplined silence that screamed of power. Their faces were like stone. At their head rode a man who radiated authority. He was older, his long hair streaked with silver. He sat on his horse with a ramrod straight posture that made him look like a king. He wore no war paint, just a stern, unyielding expression. Lydia knew in the deepest part of her soul who this had to be. Chief Blackwood. And riding on either side of him, on ponies led by other warriors, were Nita and Kai. Nita sat tall, the gash on her face a clean, healing line. Ka was propped up, her splinted leg resting carefully. But she was alive. They were here, and they had brought their father. Panic exploded in Redemption Gulch. Men scrambled for their rifles. Women screamed and dragged their kids inside. The street, bustling moments before, was suddenly empty, except for the glint of steel from behind windows and barrels. Sheriff Barton stumbled out onto the street, shotgun in hand. He was trying to look brave, but the tremor in his hands gave him away. He stood alone in the dust, a fool trying to stare down a force of nature. The Apache procession didn't stop. They rode into town like they owned it, their ponies' hooves kicking up a fine red dust that settled over everything. They ignored the rifles. They ignored the sheriff. Their eyes were fixed on one thing, the outcast shack on the edge of town. They were riding directly for Lydia. Lydia stood frozen, a small gardening trowel falling from her limp fingers. Her heart was trying to beat its way out of her chest. This was it. Barton's trouble had arrived. Had Nita told her father about the bullet? Were they here for justice or vengeance? Was this an execution squad sent to kill the only witness? The riders formed a silent, menacing semicircle around her small property, cutting her off from the terrified town. Chief Blackwood halted his horse right in front of her. He dismounted with a fluid grace that made him seem half his age. Nita and Kai were helped from their ponies, leaning on other warriors for support. Their eyes were locked on Lydia. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. The chief's dark, penetrating eyes swept over Lydia, taking in her faded dress, her calloused hands, her humble shack. It wasn't a hostile look. It was analytical, as if he were weighing her soul on a scale. Finally he spoke, not in his own tongue, but in clear, heavily accented English, a fact that sent a new wave of shock through the hidden watchers of the town. "You are Lydia Mayhew." It wasn't a question. Lydia found her voice. "I am." The chief looked from her to his daughters. Nita gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "My daughters have told me what you have done," Chief Blackwood's voice boomed in the stillness. "You found them broken. You used your knowledge to mend their bodies. You did this knowing they were Apache, knowing your people would condemn you." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the town. "In our culture, a life saved creates a debt that cannot be ignored. You have saved not one, but two daughters of a chief. This is a debt of blood. It is the greatest debt, and it must be repaid." Lydia swallowed hard. "There is no debt. I only did what was right." A grim, humorless smile touched the chief's lips. "No," he said, his gaze returning to the shuttered windows. "Not anyone would have done this." Then he did something that no one could have predicted. A warrior brought him a long, ceremonial staff decorated with eagle feathers. The chief strode a few paces into the dusty ground between Lydia's shack and the town. "We have no gold, no silver," he boomed. "We pay our debts with that which gives life." He drove the base of the staff deep into the parched earth. "This debt will now be paid," he declared. "For saving the blood of my blood, we, the Apache people, hereby grant ownership of the lifeblood of this valley. From this day forward, the Whispering Creek and all the land for 50 paces on either side is no longer the property of your town. It is no longer Apache land." He turned and pointed with his entire being at the trembling, stunned figure of Lydia Mayhew. "It is hers. The water," he pronounced, his voice dropping to a deadly serious tone, "now belongs to her." But as the town reeled in shock, Lydia realized something terrible. The chief wasn't just giving her a gift. He was handing her a weapon, and he was forcing her to choose a side in a war she didn't even know had started. For a full minute, the only sound in Redemption Gulch was the frantic beating of hearts. The townspeople, hiding in their homes, were in a state of pure catatonic shock. The Whispering Creek wasn't just some stream, it was their life, the only source of fresh water for 100 miles. It watered their animals, their pathetic little gardens, and filled every single cup and bucket. To control the creek was to control the town, and that power, the power of life and death, had just been handed to the town pariah, the hedge witch. Sheriff Barton found his voice first. It came out as a strangled, disbelieving laugh. "You're insane. You can't just give away a river. That creek belongs to this town." Chief Blackwood turned his head slowly, his eyes pinning the sheriff with cold contempt. "Your laws are paper. Ours are blood. She saved my daughters. We give her the water that gives life. The exchange is just." He turned back to Lydia. "The gift is given. How you use its power is your choice." With a sharp command, the Apache warriors mounted up. Nita locked eyes with Lydia one last time, a look of gratitude mixed with a clear warning. Then, as silently as they came, they were gone, leaving behind a feathered staff stuck in the ground, a terrified town, and one young woman who had just become the most powerful and hated person in the entire territory. The moment the last rider vanished, the dam of fear broke, and a flood of rage poured out. The townspeople spilled into the street, not at Lydia, but in a furious swarm around Sheriff Barton. "He can't do that, can he, Sheriff?" cried Mr. Gable, his face slick with sweat. "It's a savage trick," shrieked Mrs. Hemlock. "She's in on it. She planned the whole thing. That witch." The word witch spread like a disease. All their fear of the Apache now had a single vulnerable target: Lydia. She stood by her door, the angry shouts washing over her. She looked at the feathered staff, a symbol of a gift that felt exactly like a curse. She hadn't asked for this. All she'd ever wanted was to be left alone. Sheriff Barton, seeing his authority evaporating, needed to get it back. "Everyone calm down," he roared. "It's just the word of a savage. It means nothing. We'll pull that stick out of the ground, and that'll be the end of it." He strode toward the staff, his hand outstretched. But a voice cut through the noise, calm and clear. "I wouldn't do that." Every head turned. Lydia had stepped forward, her chin high. The timid girl was gone. In her place stood someone else. "And why not, Mayhew?" Barton sneered. "Think this feather stick has some kind of magic?" "No," Lydia said, her voice steady. "But Chief Blackwood does. He paid a debt according to his laws. If you defy that gift, you are telling him his daughters' lives are worthless. What do you think he will do then?" Her words hit them like a physical blow. They had seen the warriors. They knew she was right. To pull out that staff was to invite a war they couldn't win. 30 warriors was a formal escort. A war party would burn Redemption Gulch to the ground before breakfast. Barton's face turned a mottled red. He was trapped. He couldn't attack Lydia without risking annihilation, and he couldn't accept the situation without looking like a fool. The crowd murmured, their rage now poisoned with the terrifying realization that they were hostages, and their jailer was the girl they had tormented for a decade. Lydia looked at their hateful, frightened faces. The weight of the river settled on her shoulders. The chief had said the power was hers to wield. But as she faced the snarling mob, she had a sinking feeling that this power wasn't a gift or a weapon. It was a trap, and she just walked right into it. The standoff began, a silent, ugly war that lasted for 2 days. Lydia stayed in her shack. The town simmered in its own impotent fury. Life became a grim parody of normal. Twice a day, the townspeople would walk to the boundary line marked by the staff, empty buckets in hand, led by a humiliated Sheriff Barton. Lydia would emerge from her shack and just stand there, her presence an undeniable claim. They wouldn't speak. They would just glare at her with pure hatred before proceeding to the creek to fill their buckets. Every bucket of water was a fresh wound to their pride. For Lydia, it was a waking nightmare. She let them take the water, of course. She wasn't a monster. But she could feel the pressure building, the resentment getting thicker every hour. Barton was coming unglued. His power had been stripped away in front of everyone, and it was driving him insane. On the evening of the second day, he called a town meeting in the saloon. Lydia could hear the angry, drunken shouts from her shack. Barton's voice was the loudest, slurring but clear. He was whipping them into a frenzy, calling her a demon, an Apache collaborator who would poison them in their sleep. He was turning their humiliation into a righteous excuse for murder. Lydia knew what was coming. She barred her flimsy door and sat in the dark, her heart pounding. Shortly after midnight, the saloon doors burst open. About 15 men, their courage drowned in cheap whiskey, stumbled into the moonlight. They carried rifles, pitchforks, and axes. Sheriff Barton was at their head, a bottle in one hand, his shotgun in the other. "No more!" he roared. "We're not going to be held hostage by some hedge witch. That water is ours. We're taking it back." The mob screamed its approval and started marching toward her shack. This was it. This was how she died, torn apart by the people she'd lived beside her whole life. She scrambled to the back window, her mind racing. There was nowhere to go. Just as the first men reached the Apache staff, ready to kick it over, a new sound cut through the night. Not horses, it was the whisper of an arrow. An arrow fletched with black and white feathers, sliced through the air and buried itself deep in her door, inches from a man's head. It quivered there, a deadly, silent warning. The mob froze. Every head snapped towards the rocky outcrops overlooking the town. There, silhouetted against the moon, stood two figures. Even from a distance, their size was unmistakable. Nita and Ka. Nita held a bow, another arrow already knocked. Ka, leaning on a crutch, leveled a rifle, its barrel glinting in the pale light. They weren't victims anymore. They were sentinels. Barton stared, his drunken courage vanishing like smoke. "It's just two of them," he yelled, trying to rally his men. "We can take them." He raised his shotgun toward the rocks. Before he could fire, another arrow flew. This one wasn't a warning. It hit the whiskey bottle in his hand, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The message couldn't be clearer. The next one wouldn't miss. Then a low guttural cry echoed from the hills to the east. It was answered by another from the west, and another until a chorus of ghost-like calls surrounded the town. They were completely, utterly surrounded. The chief hadn't just left his daughters, he'd left his warriors, hidden, watching. The gift had come with invisible guardians. The men in the mob looked at each other, their faces slick with sweat and fear. The drunken rage was gone, replaced by the sober, terrifying truth. They weren't facing one helpless girl. They were facing the full, unseen might of the Apache Nation. One by one, they backed away, dropping their weapons, melting back into the shadows. Soon, only Sheriff Barton was left, standing alone in the street, soaked in whiskey, his authority shattered forever. Lydia watched through a crack in her wall and slid to the floor, her body trembling. She hadn't been alone. The debt worked both ways. She had saved them, and now they had saved her. From the rocks above, two warrior women kept their silent vigil, ensuring the siege of Redemption Gulch was over. But Lydia knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The mob was gone, but the real enemy, the one with the rifle, was still in this town. And he knew that she knew. Dawn broke over a town that felt hungover and ashamed. The streets were empty. The arrow was still stuck in Lydia's door. She pulled it free, running her fingers over the sharp stone point. It was a symbol of her salvation, but also of the deep, bloody chasm between her world and Nita's. The violence was over for now, but the real problem remained. The water, the town's hatred, and the secret of the bullet. She couldn't live like this, a prisoner in her own home, guarded by ghosts on the ridge. It was a slow-motion death sentence. She knew what she had to do. It was the biggest risk of her life. She walked into the center of town, holding the arrow. She stopped by the public well and waited. Slowly, people began to emerge from their homes, their faces pale and uncertain. Mrs. Hemlock watched from her porch, confused. Mr. Gable stood in his doorway, wringing his hands. The last to appear was Sheriff Barton. He looked like a wreck. He'd lost control of the town, and he knew it. His eyes were full of dull, defeated rage. When a small crowd had gathered, Lydia spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Last night solved nothing," she began. "This can't continue. I never asked for the creek. I never wanted power over any of you." She looked at their faces, seeing not a mob but scared, desperate people. "The Apache gave me this gift to honor a debt. I cannot refuse it without dishonoring them, and putting us all in danger. But their way is not our way. They see a gift as a responsibility. She held up the arrow. This is a symbol of their power, but it's also a symbol of their restraint. They could have destroyed us last night. They did not. She took a deep breath. So here is my decision. The creek is mine. That is the Apache law, and we will respect it. But water is for all living things. From this day forward, I will be the keeper of the creek, not its owner. Everyone may come and take what they need, freely, without price. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd, but she wasn't finished. Her voice hardened as she looked directly at Sheriff Barton. But this is built on respect. There will be rules. No one wastes the water, no one fouls it, and the Apache will have access to it as well. When they pass, they will be allowed to water their horses. This creek will no longer be a border between us. It will be a bridge. It was a radical, impossible idea. Coexistence. She wasn't giving the creek back. She was changing what it meant. It was no longer a possession, but a shared trust. Barton scoffed. You expect us to share our water with them? Before anyone could agree, Mr. Gable, the store owner, stepped forward. She's right, Barton, he said, his voice firm. She's offering us our lives back. She holds all the cards and she ain't asking for a single cent. Just decency. I reckon that's a bargain. Mrs. Hemlock stared at Lydia with a look of dawning, grudging respect. The power in the town shifted for good, away from Barton's fear and toward Lydia's quiet strength. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm took hold. The townspeople, humbled, began to treat Lydia with deference. They brought her real gifts, a new dress, tools for her garden. One day, a small party of Apache, led by Nita, appeared on the far side of the creek. The town watched, tense. Lydia walked down to meet them. They watered their horses. Nita gave Lydia a beautifully woven basket. They spoke for a few minutes, two women from different worlds, standing on the bridge they had built. It seemed like peace, but it was a fragile peace, because the Gable boys were still missing, and the bullet was still in Lydia's pocket. Lydia knew she was living on borrowed time. The town's acceptance was conditional. It depended on the Apache staying away, and on the fate of the Gable boys remaining a mystery. Every time she saw Mr. and Mrs. Gable, their faces etched with a grief they couldn't speak of, a knot of guilt tightened in her stomach. She was the keeper of a truth that could shatter this new peace. One evening, as she was sweeping the floor of her shack, she noticed a loose floorboard she'd never seen before. Her parents had built this shack. They weren't careless builders. Curiosity got the better of her. She pried it up. Underneath was a small, hollow space, and inside that space was a leather-bound journal. Her father's journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. His familiar, neat handwriting filled the pages. It was mostly about his prospecting, his hopes and dreams. But as she read on, the entries grew darker, more fearful. He wrote about finding a rich vein of silver, not out in the claims, but right there on their own small property, near the banks of the Whispering Creek. He wrote about keeping it a secret, fearing what would happen if the wrong people found out. The last entry was dated the day before he and her mother took the fever. It was short and chilling. Barton knows. He was here today. He saw the ore. He said the town needed a strong leader. He said dreamers like us just get in the way. God help us. The journal fell from her hands. It wasn't the fever. It was murder. Sheriff Barton had murdered her parents for the silver he thought was on their land. The man who had terrorized her for a decade was the man who had made her an orphan. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Barton's desperation to control the town. His immediate suspicion of her after the incident in the canyon. His violent reaction to the chief's gift of the creek. He wasn't just afraid of losing power. He was terrified that the Apache, or Lydia, would stumble upon the silver he had killed for. The silver that was likely the real reason the Gable boys went into the canyon in the first place. Barton must have sent them. A cold, hard fury unlike anything she had ever felt settled in her heart. This was no longer about keeping the peace. This was about justice, vengeance. She looked at the arrow Nita had given her. She looked at her father's journal. She now had two secrets, two pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of pure evil. She had to expose him. But how? He was the law. His word against the town witch. It was no contest. She needed proof, and she had a horrifying idea of where to find it. The place where the Gable boys had disappeared. She had to go back to the canyon. The decision to go back was the hardest she'd ever made. The canyon was no longer a place of peace. It was a place of ghosts and unanswered questions. She waited for a moonless night, packing a small satchel with water, some dried meat, and her father's journal. She left a note on her table, a simple one, telling the town she had gone to seek answers about the Gable boys. It was a risk, but it was the only way. If she didn't come back, at least they would know why. She slipped out of town like a shadow, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The journey was filled with a new kind of dread. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Was Barton following her? Were the Apache warriors watching? She made her way to the wash where she had found Nita and Ka. The place was eerily silent. The bloodstains were gone, scoured away by the wind and sand. But the memory of the violence hung in the air. She began to search, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the Gable boys, any clue as to what had happened after she'd left. She followed the wash deeper into the canyon, towards the area where Nita had indicated they were attacked. After hours of searching, she found it. A makeshift campsite, hastily abandoned. A bedroll. An empty whiskey bottle. And near the cold campfire pit, the ground was disturbed. The dirt and rocks kicked around as if from a struggle. Then she saw it, a glint of metal half buried in the sand. She dug it out. It was a silver belt buckle with the initial G engraved on it. Jebediah Gables. And a few feet away, almost completely covered by a rock slide, she found the body. It was Jebediah's brother, his eyes wide with a final, silent scream, a single, neat hole in his chest. But the bullet hadn't come from an Apache rifle. The ground around him was littered with spent cartridges. Cartridges from a town-issued rifle, like the one Sheriff Barton carried. He hadn't been killed by Nita and Kai. He'd been executed. Suddenly, a voice echoed down the canyon walls, dripping with false sympathy. "Looks like you found my dirty work, Mayhew." Lydia spun around, her blood turning to ice. Sheriff Barton stood on the ridge above her, his shotgun leveled at her chest. And beside him, held by the scruff of his neck, was Jebediah Gable, his face bruised and swollen with terror. "He was the only one left alive," Barton drawled. "A bit of a loose end, just like you." Jebediah looked at Lydia, his eyes pleading. "He made us do it. He told us the Apache had gold. He sent us to attack him, to start a war so the cavalry would come and clear him out for good. But they fought back. Nita and Kai. They fought like devils. My brother." He panicked. He was going to run back to town and tell everyone. So Barton, he just shot him. "He talks too much," Barton said, pressing the shotgun harder against Jebediah's head. "See, Mayhew, this land is about to be worth a fortune. A railroad is coming through. But they won't build on Apache land, so the Apache have to go. A little massacre, some dead prospectors. It's the perfect excuse. Your parents figured it out years ago, too. Found silver right by the creek. Couldn't have that. Dreamers always get in the way of progress." He smiled, a truly evil sight. "Now you've made a real mess of things, making friends with the chief, gaining control of the water. But it ends here. They'll find your bodies in a few days, another tragic victim of an Apache attack, and I'll finally have the war I need." He cocked the shotgun. This was it, the end of the line. But as Barton's finger tightened on the trigger, a shadow fell over him. A massive shadow. He looked up, his sneer faltering for the first time. Standing on the rock behind him, silent as the grave, was Nita, and next to her, Ka, no longer on a crutch, holding her rifle steady. And behind them, stepping out from the rocks and shadows, were 30 Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, their bows drawn taut. They had been watching. They had followed her. The debt worked both ways. Nita looked down at Barton, her eyes filled with a cold, righteous fury. "You," she said in perfect English, her voice like the winter wind. "You are the one who shot my sister." Barton was so shocked he couldn't even move. He had walked right into his own trap. And now justice was here, and it was not going to be merciful. Barton's face, illuminated by the harsh canyon moonlight, went from smug confidence to pure, slack-jawed terror. He was surrounded, outmaneuvered. He stammered, trying to raise his shotgun, but a single sharp command from Nita froze him in place. The warriors on the ridge drew their bowstrings tighter, the sound a low, ominous hum in the sudden silence. They were a jury and an executioner, all in one. Jebediah Gable, seeing his chance, collapsed into a blubbering heap on the ground, sobbing and pleading for his life. Nita ignored him. Her eyes were locked on Barton. She slid down the rock face with the grace of a mountain lion, landing silently on the canyon floor just a few feet from him. Ka remained on the ridge, her rifle never wavering. "My father, Chief Blackwood, he suspected treachery from your town," Nita said, her English surprisingly fluent and sharp. "He learned it from traders. He heard whispers of a man in a dusty town, a man with a star, who was trying to start a fire. He knew the gift of the water would not be a gift of peace. It was a test, to see if the snake would show its head. And you, Sheriff, you are the snake." She took a step closer. "You shot my sister. You sent these fools to murder us. You murdered this girl's parents. You have a debt of blood with my people, and with her." She glanced at Lydia, a flicker of something new in her eyes. Not just gratitude, but kinship, a shared enemy, a shared fight for justice. Barton finally found his voice, a pathetic squeak. "It was for progress, for the town. You savages are standing in the way of the future." Lydia stepped forward, her father's journal clutched in her hand. "You murdered my parents for a vein of silver you never even found," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You terrorized this town for 10 years, all to protect your dirty secret. You are not a leader. You are a cancer." The truth, spoken aloud, seemed to echo in the canyon. The warriors on the ridge let out a low, guttural cry of agreement. The sound sealed Barton's fate. Nita looked from the terrified sheriff to Lydia. "According to our laws," she said, "justice is simple. A life for a life. He has taken many. His life is forfeit." She drew the long knife from her belt, but then she paused. She looked at Lydia, at the journal in her hand, and then towards the direction of Redemption Gulch. "But you are the keeper of the creek," Nita said. "You are the bridge between our worlds. This is your town, your justice. What is your law?" It was a shocking twist. Nita was handing the final decision to her, the power to kill or to spare the man who had ruined her life. Every warrior, every eye was on her. The fate of Sheriff Barton, and perhaps the future of the entire valley, rested on her next words. Lydia looked at Barton, a pathetic, trembling coward stripped of all his power. She saw the face of the man who had murdered her parents, who had condemned her to a decade of loneliness and scorn. Every fiber of her being screamed for revenge, to let Nita's knife do its work. It would be so easy, so just. But then she looked at Jebediah Gable, sobbing in the dust. He was a weak man, a follower, but he was still one of her people. And she thought of the town, frightened, ignorant, but not all evil. Killing Barton here, in the dark, the Apache way, would solve one problem but create a bigger one. It would forever mark the Apache as savages in the town's eyes. It would turn Barton into a martyr and poison the fragile peace she had worked so hard to build. The bridge would collapse before it was even finished. "My law," Lydia said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority, "is truth." She turned her gaze not to Nita, but to Jebediah. "You will get up, you will walk back to town, and you will tell everyone what happened here. You will tell them everything, about the plan to start a war, about Barton murdering your brother, about him murdering my parents." Jebediah stared at her, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "He'll kill me." "No," Lydia said, her gaze shifting to Barton. "He won't." She then looked back up at Nita. "His punishment won't be a quick death in the dark. His punishment will be to face the people he lied to be stripped of his star and his pride in the light of day. He will live with his crimes. He will be an outcast, just like he made me." Nita stared at Lydia for a long moment, a complex expression on her face. It was not the justice she would have chosen, but she understood it. She saw the wisdom in it, the strength. With a sharp nod, she sheathed her knife. Your justice is hard, she said. We will honor it. Two warriors descended from the ridge. They bound Barton's hands and hauled him to his feet. They did the same to Jebediah. They would be escorted back to Redemption Gulch, not as prisoners of the Apache, but as criminals to be delivered to their own people. As the sun began to rise, the strange procession started the long walk back. Lydia walked at the head, beside Nita, no longer an outcast but a leader. She was bringing the truth home, and she knew that the light of this new day would finally, after 10 long years, bring justice to Redemption Gulch. The return to town was a spectacle no one would ever forget. Lydia, flanked by Nita and two imposing Apache warriors, marched the bound and defeated Sheriff Barton and the weeping Jebediah Gable right down the main street. The townspeople poured out of their homes, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and awe. They saw their swaggering sheriff, now humbled and broken. They gathered at the well, the heart of the town, the very place where Lydia had declared her new law. Jebediah, forced to his feet, told them everything. His voice cracked and he sobbed. But he told the whole ugly story. The plot to start a war, the murder of his brother. He pointed at Barton. He killed my parents. Lydia's voice cut through the stunned silence as she held up her father's journal. He murdered them for silver he thought was on their land. He let this town think I was a curse, all to hide the fact that he was the monster. The town turned as one to face Barton. The hatred they had once directed at Lydia now found its true target. It was a terrifying, righteous fury. Mr. Gable stepped forward and spat in Barton's face. Mrs. Hemlock, the gossip, was silent, her face pale with the shame of her own ignorance. They stripped the star from Barton's chest and locked him in his own jail cell to await the circuit judge. The town, in one single shocking moment, was reborn. The old power structure was shattered. The lies were burned away by the truth. Nita and her warriors did not linger. Their task was done. Before she left, Nita gripped Lydia's forearm. You chose a difficult path, she said, but it was the path of a chief. She smiled a true, warm smile. The bridge you built is strong. With that, they melted back into the wilderness, leaving Lydia standing in the center of her town, her people. Lydia Mayhew never married. She never had children. She didn't need to. The entire town became her family. She remained the keeper of the creek, but she was also their healer, their advisor, and the unshakable conscience of Redemption Gulch. The story of the outcast girl who was gifted a river, who faced down a murderer and brought justice with truth instead of a gun, became a legend. A story told to children about how real courage isn't about being the toughest, but about being the most compassionate. The legacy of the hedge witch of the gulch wasn't written in stone, but in the clear, life-giving water that flowed freely for everyone. A lasting testament to a shocking decision that brought not war, but a new and better beginning. The story of Lydia Mayhew reminds us that the true heroes aren't always the ones with the fastest gun or the shiniest badge. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the outcasts who choose kindness in a world that rewards cruelty. Lydia's journey shows that one person's courage can be more powerful than a drunken mob, and one act of compassion can change the world. She didn't just save two lives in a canyon. She saved an entire town from its own hatred, transforming a border of fear into a bridge of peace. She proves that true strength isn't about what you own, but about what you share. If this story of unlikely courage and the enduring power of truth resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a story with a real heart. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the Untamed West that you won't find in any history book. Thanks for listening.